Hey guys, it's Bella. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are all having an incredible day today. Hope you're ready to get stuck into part 2 of the family murders. I will link part 1 down below in the description if you haven't seen it. It's also just the most recent video on my channel after this one. In part 1 though, we spoke about the 5 murders that a suspected group of people referred to as the family committed. Before we get into the case, I just want to thank today's sponsor Woodard for making this video possible. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be working with one of my favorite brands of all time. I get literally all of my jewelry from Woodard because it's all just so timeless and classic, and the quality is amazing, and I'm just so excited to be working with them. I wear these necklaces almost every single day, and every time they're visible in a post or story I always get a million questions where they're from, and they're from Woodard. They go with absolutely everything, and they're just my favorite necklaces ever. This one is the engravable tag necklace, which I got engraved with a little bee for Bella, and then this one is the gold chain necklace, and I got a K diamond letter pendant to go on it. And then I'm also wearing the paved diamond midi hoops, the medium tube hoops, and the diamond mini cluster studs, which I just am obsessed with. I think they just stack so well together on the ears. And this is also another everyday piece for me. It is the solo diamond baguette bracelet. It's just so subtle and classic, and I love it. Jewelry just always brings a little bit more pizzazz to your outfit and just to how you look. I feel like it always makes me feel like I look a little bit more put together, which is why I love these everyday Woodard pieces so much, because they're the same pieces that I wear every single day. They go with everything. Like I said, they're just so timeless and classic, and I always just feel a little bit more put together when I'm wearing them. And Woodard does new drops every single Monday with new and fresh pieces, so there's always something to look for. I'll leave links to all the pieces I've spoken about in the description down below, and also a link to the Woodard website so you can have a squiz at all of their beautiful pieces. Honestly, there's so much goodness. I would buy the entire website if I could. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back into part 2 of the case. So in 1978, the drug Mandrax had some stricter laws put on it in Australia because it was known to be used in quite a lot of date rape crimes, and so from that point forward, chemists had to record their stock levels every 3 months, and the Central Board of Health also had to approve the prescribing of Mandrax if it was going to be used for longer than 6 months. So after this, the stock of the drug was reducing more and more in Australia. It was being prescribed less and less, and there was also a record of every single time it was prescribed to somebody and who it was prescribed to. As Mandrax was used to sedate both Mark Langley and Richard Kelvin, detectives Bob O'Brien and Trevor Kipling in 1983 went to the Adelaide Health Commission building where all of the copies of prescriptions of restricted drugs were kept in South Australia. They began sorting through the thousands and thousands of scripts there, and then after about an hour, so pretty quickly actually considering how many scripts there were there to go through, Kipling picked up a prescription with the name Bevan Ironum on it, which is obviously a pretty unique name, and he immediately recalled an incident he had heard of that occurred about 10 months prior on the 13th of September in 1982, so about 6 months after Mark Langley disappeared. At around midnight, a 16-year-old boy named George was hitchhiking along Lower Portrush Road near the Torrens River when a man in his mid to late 30s in a bronze Ford Falcon offered him a ride, which George accepted. As they were driving, the man offered to take George to this party. He said there'd be drinks there, there'd be girls there, and so George accepted, and the guy who was driving was like, okay, do you want a beer from my esky in the back of his car, which George took. And then when they got to the house, they were greeted by a bunch of young women, and George was offered more alcohol in the house. The man who drove him there gave him 2 pills, which he claimed would help keep him up. George remembers going into one of the bedrooms with one of the older women there, and they had sex while the man who drove him there watched them, and George actually passed out in the middle of it. The next day, 72 hours after he was picked up, he was sent home in a taxi in quite a bit of pain, and after he got home, he decided to go to the Holden Hill police station to report that he had been sexually assaulted and drugged. He agreed to a medical examination, which found that he had tears in his anus and had been raped, and they also found Mandrax in his system, which is the reason he passed out. A detective named Sam Bass tracked down the taxi driver that dropped George home, and he found that George had been picked up from an address in Alberton. So Bass went to this address and found that 3 people lived there, a homosexual man and 2 transgender women who were referred to as P and K, and they told him that the man who had picked up George was named Bevan Spencer von Ironum. So Bass went to von Ironum's work to interview him, but von Ironum didn't want to be questioned at his work and agreed to meet him later at the Holden Hill police station to be interviewed. During the interview, von Ironum admitted that he did pick up George. He did take him to a party where there were girls, there was drugs, there was alcohol, but he said that he didn't give him any pills. He said that he didn't watch him have sex with P, and he said that when he went into the bedroom with P, after they were done, P came out, went into the lounge room. Von Ironum then went into P's bedroom and slept on P's bed with George, and he said that nothing happened. George was under the covers the whole time, he was on top of the covers the whole time, and the next morning when George came to, he was super groggy to the point where he actually had to shower and dress George and then put him in a taxi home. After this interview, police went back to the Alberton house to question the residents there, and they ended up taking P down to the Port Adelaide police station where she was arrested for raping George. And according to police, this arrest wasn't just for the rape, it was also to try and put pressure on Von Ironum's friends to start talking about him. The case against P though was ultimately dismissed when no evidence was put forward because they had a lot of trouble trying to prove that she knew about the drugging and that she had forced herself on George. So let me quickly tell you guys a little bit about Bevan Spencer Von Ironum. He was born on the 29th of May in 1945 and was described as soft-spoken, charming and intelligent. He was musically gifted and was a member of the Harp Society, and he had a great relationship with his mother and would really do anything for her, and her friends would always say things like they wish they had a son like Bevan. In 1965, he began working as a bookkeeper at Pipeline Supplies of Australia and eventually worked his way up to work there as an accountant. He was respected at the company and was allowed access to the building on weekends. The building was located in Regency Park, which is just 2 kilometres from where Alan Barnes was picked up on Grand Junction Road. Now, Von Ironum had actually first become known to police in 1972, and not because of any crime he had committed or anything like that, it was actually quite the opposite. Unfortunately, at the time, Australia wasn't very tolerant of homosexuality, which is incredibly messed up. It was actually still illegal at the time, which is like, how can you make it illegal for somebody to love another person? So in 1972, there was a toilet block along the Torrens River, which was referred to as the number 1 beat, and it was known to be a place where gay men could go and find hookups. Because it was a known hookup spot, police officers from the Vice Squad would go there not only to detain people for loitering in these known hookup spots, but they would also attack them, which is exactly what happened on the 10th of May in 1972. At around 11 p.m, 3 men, Dr. George Duncan, Roger James, and a third unidentified man were beaten by members of the Vice Squad and thrown into the river. Roger's leg had been broken upon his impact into the river, and so he was unable to help George, who due to his own injuries drowned. The 2 men could do nothing but watch this in horror, and meanwhile the police officers were teasing and taunting them, telling them to save their mate. Roger was saved by a passing motorist, Bevan Spencer Von Ironum, who drove him to the Royal Adelaide Hospital. The case caused public outrage, and it led to South Australia being the first Australian state to decriminalise homosexuality in 1975. Years later, in February of 1986, 3 former Vice Squad officers, Brian Hudson, Francis Corley and Michael Clayton, were charged with the manslaughter of George Duncan. Corley and Clayton eventually went to trial in 1998, however both men were acquitted. Anyway, on the 28th of July 1983, 4 days after Richard Kelvin's body was found, Detective Bob O'Brien went to Von Ironum's home in Paradise where he lived with his mother, and when they knocked on the door and asked to speak to him about Mandrax, he said that he didn't feel comfortable talking to them without his solicitor present, and he agreed to meet them later at the Angus Street police station with his solicitor. During this interview, police asked him if he had been prescribed Mandrax, and he said that he had about 5 years ago to help him sleep, but that he hadn't taken any pills in 12 months because he had switched to Rohypnol, but that he did still have some Mandrax pills at his house. When asked what he was doing the night Richard Kelvin disappeared, he said that he had actually been sick that weekend and had actually taken the entire week off work to recover. He denied having any knowledge of what happened to Richard Kelvin, Neil Muir, Mark Langley, Alan Barnes, and Peter Stogneff. Detective Bob O'Brien wrote about this interview in his book Youngbloods, and there's a part of the interview that he wrote about that I want to read you a part of because it's really weird. So Detective Trevor Kipling asked Von Ironum, "Could you conceivably abduct a youth, drug him, abuse him, and then kill him?" To which Von Ironum replied no. Kipling then asked him why not, to which Von Ironum replied, "I think it would be unethical of me. I shy away from violence of any description." And underneath that, Detective Bob O'Brien wrote, "They were interesting words. I didn't know what to make of them. They weren't words a normal person would use," which I kind of agree. Hey, if someone asked me why I couldn't conceivably drug, abduct, abuse, and kill someone, I would say because I'm not a psycho and that's fucked. I wouldn't say, because I think it would be unethical of me. Anyway, von Ironum did agree to let police take samples of his hair, his blood, and also scrapings of underneath his fingernails. Later that same day, at around 4:15 p.m, he also allowed officers to search his house, and they also asked if he could search his 2 cars, a silver Toyota and a bronze Ford Falcon, but turns out he had actually sold the Ford Falcon, but not before having the entire boot of the vehicle repainted, the interior of the boot. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So they searched the silver Toyota and they searched his house. In his bedroom, they found his harp at the base of the bed, and then to the side of the bed, they found this bag which contained Cinequan, Serapax, Valium, and Rohypnol. Are you interested in what they found in his bag too, Hunter? A lot of pills, huh? Do you want to tell them where the Mandrax was? It was in a hidden ledge in his bathroom, behind the mirror. It was hidden. Can you believe it? Can you believe that? There were 2 bottles with about 40 pills in there. And then you know what happened? They asked him if he had anything else hidden in the bathroom, and you know what he said? He said no. And then you know what happened? Bob O'Brien checked the hidden ledge again, and you know what he found? He found Noctec. I know, can you believe it? When asked if he had anything else hidden in the house, von Ironum said no, but Detective Bob O'Brien decided to check the hidden ledge again, and he found a bottle of pills labeled Noctec, and von Ironum quickly defended himself and was like, oh, I don't use them very often. It just so happens that Noctec is the active ingredient in chloral hydrate, which was found in the systems of a few of the murder victims. Before leaving the house, crime scene examiners took photos of the house inside and out. They took fingerprints from around the house, they took samples of fibers from around the house to compare them to fibers found on the clothes of the murder victims, and they were done by about 10 p.m. Later that night, on his way home, Detective Bob O'Brien decided to stop by von Ironum's house, not to go in or anything. He just stayed outside in his car and noticed that there was a car parked in von Ironum's driveway. And when he ran the number plates, he realized that it was a known associate of von Ironum's, who was an affluent businessman who worked in Adelaide CBD, and we don't know his name because it has been suppressed. Now at this point, detectives don't have enough evidence to arrest von Ironum for any of the murders, but he's definitely their prime suspect. He was a gay man who often visited the beats. He was known to pick up and sexually abuse young boys. He had Noctec in his house, which was found in the systems of Alan Barnes and Mark Langley, and he also had 3 of the 4 drugs that were found in Richard Kelvin's system. So on the 19th of September, Detective Trevor Kipling led a raid of the businessman's house, who I just mentioned before. His car was parked in von Ironum's driveway. He was, as I mentioned, a known associate of von Ironum, and his name had also been mentioned a few times to police in the form of anonymous tips. The businessman was home at the time the raid was conducted, but he refused to speak to police. All he said was that he had been a friend of von Ironum's for years. He denied any knowledge of the murders, and nothing incriminating was found in his house. After the raid, detectives searched his shop, which was a 2-story building on one of Adelaide's main shopping roads in the CBD. The business was conducted on the ground floor of the shop, and the administration was conducted upstairs, but there was one room upstairs that had nothing in it except for a bare mattress on the floor, which, if you ask me, is pretty sketchy, especially when you consider some of the victims were kept alive before they were murdered, especially Richard Kelvin, who was kept alive for up to 5 weeks being tortured before he was eventually murdered. But detectives seized that mattress and found no evidence whatsoever. They also checked the businessman's car and once again came up empty-handed. Obviously, though, police were still sus on him and just put him under surveillance for quite a long period of time. They found that his behavior was almost compulsive in the way that he would seek out male attention. Every day he would open his business at the exact same time. He would close at exactly 12 o'clock for 1 hour, and during that hour he would drive to the number 1 beat to see what was happening there, and then he would drive around to other beats, and then at the end of his lunch break he would return to work. And then despite the fact that he lived really close to his business, he would repeat the same routine after his work, searching twice a day for young men to pick up, and even when he went to events, he would go home via the beats. The businessman had a roommate named Stephen Woodard, who was a doctor, and he was theorized to have taken some part in the crime spree, and in 2011 he actually faced charges for sexual assaults that took place in the 1980s. Police obviously connected the 3 men, Woodard's, the businessman, and von Ironum, and point theorized that they all may have been involved in some way, that Von Ironum was responsible for abducting and drugging the young boys. They would then take them back to the businessman's shop, and that Woodards would perform the surgical acts on them, like the mutilation of Neil Muir's body, Peter Stogdeff's body, and the surgery performed on Mark Langley. But other than driving around the beats looking for the company of men, there was nothing incriminating that police found, and certainly nothing to prove the theory that they were all connected to these crimes. Now, if you remember, in part 1, I mentioned that detectives received a call in August of 1979, around the time that Alan Barnes's body was found, that implicated Von Ironum as Alan's killer. Well, 4 years later, they managed to track down this caller, who came to be known as Mr. B, and he agreed to speak with detectives as long as they kept his name private and if they met in isolated locations. At the time, he was in his 20s, meaning that he was a teenager when the crimes began. Mr. B said that he had befriended Von Ironum back in June of 1979, which is about the same time that Alan Barnes disappeared, and he said that he and Von Ironum had become like partners in crime ever since. He told police how he and Von Ironum would drive around the streets of Adelaide in Von Ironum's car, and that he had an esky in the back that was always full of beers. He told them that they would pick up young male hitchhikers and they would get drunk on the beers in the esky while they pretended that they were going to a party where there would be more drinks and pretty women waiting for them. Once the men were drunk, they would offer them pills that they claimed would help them stay awake, but in reality these pills were actually Mandrax or Rohypnol. Mr. B also said that he and Von Ironum would take these boys back to a house in northern Adelaide where 2 transgender women lived, and that these women would provide their house as a place where they could go and take these boys to sexually assault them in exchange for drugs and other favors. Which, if you ask me, sounds like exactly what happened to George, so this story is sounding pretty credible because it's coming from 2 separate sources who don't know each other but are saying the exact same thing. Mr. B also told police how Von Ironum would go and drop his mother off at her cousin's house every second weekend, and she would stay there for the whole weekend, leaving the house to Von Ironum, and that's when he would use his own house to carry out these sexual assaults. He also told detectives about the aftermath of one of these times. He said that one night he and Von Ironum picked up these 2 young men, and by the time they got to Von Ironum's house, these 2 men were pretty much out cold. They had to carry them in one by one. Von Ironum would grab the arms and Mr. B would grab the legs, and they put the first man in Von Ironum's bedroom and the second man in the lounge room. Von Ironum then went into the bedroom and closed the door, and when Mr. B went into the bedroom to talk to Von Ironum, he said that he saw him performing horrific acts on the young man. He then asked Von Ironum to take him home, and on the way they dropped the 2 young men off at P&K's house in Alberton to sleep off the effects, and they would then go home the next day. And he said he was present for several more of these abductions but never participated in these sexual assaults. Now, by this point, police had successfully built their case against Von Ironum. They had eyewitness testimony that put him in the same locations as the victims before their disappearances and subsequent murders. They had Mr. B's testimony. They had the Mandrax and Noctec that was found in Von Ironum's home. They had spoken to some of his acquaintances who, for the most part, said that he was this tame, quiet guy. But one of his co-workers spoke about how he had a really weird sense of humor, and one time he asked him what he was doing on the weekend, and Von Ironum joked about the fact that he had murdered somebody. And then another time, he was actually seen acting inappropriately with young men in front of his co-workers. They had gotten the results back from the analysis of the fibers taken from Von Ironum's home and the fibers found on the clothes of some of the murder victims, and found that the brightly coloured fibers found on Richard Kelvin's clothes were an exact match to fibers taken from Von Ironum's carpet and bedspread. They also found 110 fibers on Richard's clothing that were an exact match to a brown cardigan found at Von Ironum's home. And so on the 3rd of November in 1983, as Von Ironum pulled into his driveway after getting home from shopping with his mum, he was arrested and charged with the murder of Richard Kelvin. He was held on remand, and his committal hearing was set for February of the following year. At first, he denied knowing 15-year-old Richard Kelvin and denied having any knowledge of what happened to him, but at his committal hearing, his attorney read a statement on behalf of him which stated that he actually had met Richard on the night of his disappearance, but that he wasn't involved in his murder.
As soon as he said, "Look, I picked up Richard Kelvin," I knew he was in a lot of trouble in terms of a jury trial, because it just the case was getting stronger and stronger against him.
The statement claimed that he had been driving around Richard's neighbourhood the night of the disappearance, going to get some fish and chips, and that he had almost hit Richard with his car. He said that he briefly spoke to Richard, and Richard noticed that he was drinking a beer and asked if he could have one, and Von Ironum said that he didn't want to get in trouble for supplying a minor with alcohol, so he invited him into the car and Richard got in willingly. As he drove Richard back to his house in Paradise, they spoke about some problems that Richard was having, like he was being bullied at school. They also spoke about his girlfriend, and this was all stuff that had been printed publicly in the newspaper. So it was something that Von Ironum very easily could have made up. Von Ironum said that once they got back to his house, they both sat on his bed together while Von Ironum played the harp for him and put his arm around him to comfort him, and after 2 hours of comforting him, he dropped him off at a local bus stop and gave him $20 to get home.
I believe he said that at some stage he had put his arm around Richard, and that would perhaps explain the cardigan fibres found on his clothing. We were able to tell from the experiments that we did that Bevan Von Ironum's alibi could not be believed.
Obviously, police did not buy the story, and Von Ironum was ordered to stand trial on the 15th of October in 1984. Now, on top of all of the evidence I've already mentioned, like the fibres and the drugs that were found at Von Ironum's house, the prosecution also presented evidence that Von Ironum got his hair dyed the day after Richard's disappearance because he started prematurely going grey at 16 and got his hair dyed every month, which seems innocent enough, and Von Ironum didn't deny it. He said that although he had the flu, the 6th of June was the only day that his hairdresser was available to do his hair. But as it turns out, 7 hairs were found on the inside of Richard's jeans, which were an exact match to the hair dye used to colour Von Ironum's hair, and they also had a small amount of grey regrowth. As I mentioned, 6 days after Richard's body was dumped, Von Ironum had the interior of his boot repainted, which he said was to get rid of rust that was caused by his esky leaking, but police believed this wasn't the case and that he actually got it repainted to remove any incriminating evidence. Von Ironum's defense didn't really produce any of their own evidence. They pretty much just tried to poke holes in the prosecution's case. They did, however, try to imply that Richard Kelvin was bisexual and that he had told Von Ironum this information because he was attracted to him, which to me is pretty messed up. It's almost like rubbing salt in the wound. You kill this 15-year-old kid because you're a sick fuck, and then you try and turn it around and say that he was attracted to you. It's just gross. During the trial, Von Ironum didn't want to be cross-examined, so he read a 12-page unsworn statement where he basically asked the jury to believe his version of events, that Richard got into his car willingly, they drank, he comforted him, dropped him off at a bus stop, and he asked them to find him not guilty. The trial ended on the 5th of November, and Bevan Spencer Von Ironum was found guilty of the murder of Richard Kelvin. As I mentioned, this was a huge case. It had blown up in the media, and the public gallery was filled to the brim with spectators from the public who burst into cheers when the verdict was announced, which is something that didn't happen very often. Von Ironum showed no emotion as the verdict was read, and I want to quickly read you what the judge said before sentencing. The horrendous nature of this crime, involving, as it did, a long period of imprisonment and ill treatment prior to murder, has added a new dimension to the kinds of murder committed in the state in which the community has to live in. You do not show remorse, you do not admit guilt, you showed yourself to be cruel and violent at the time of abduction, inventive and resourceful during imprisonment of the youth, ready to resort to lies and false alibis after the discovery of the body, and you are unrepentant at the moment. Von Ironum was sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 24 years, which was the longest possible sentence under the South Australian law at the time. The South Australian Attorney General, however, wasn't happy with this sentence and did appeal it, and so in March of 1985, the non-parole period was increased to 36 years, which was the longest non-parole period and the highest sentence ever given to anyone in South Australia. I'm going to read you a quote now from the sentencing judge, Mr. Justice Michael King. "The present crime indicates such a depravity of character on the part of the perpetrator that his absence of previous convictions loses its significance. The abduction, captivity, sedation, abuse, and murder of the boy did not occur on impulse and could only have been perpetrated by a person or persons of grossly depraved character." Von Ironum Ironum was sent to Yatala Labour Prison, and one of the first people to visit him was actually the businessman that I spoke about earlier. Surprise, surprise. So he's been convicted of the murder of Richard Kelvin, but still nobody has been convicted of the other 4 murders. Obviously, police believe that Von Ironum was involved and that he wasn't alone in these other 4 murders, but there just wasn't enough evidence to convict him or anyone else. But despite his conviction, Von Ironum wouldn't talk, he wouldn't name any associates, nothing. So in early 1988, an inquest was opened into the deaths of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Mark Langley, and Peter Stogneff after earlier inquests determined that there was enough evidence to link the cases. At the inquest, Detective Trevor Kipling spoke about a special unit that was set up by the Major Crime Squad to investigate incidences where young men had been lured into cars, drugged, and anally assaulted. There were many victims like George, who I spoke about earlier, who came forward to tell their stories, and their stories were all extremely similar. They had been lured into a car, given alcohol and pills, they then passed out and woke up at a house in Alberton where they were sent home. The coroner on the case presented findings in relation to how these boys were picked up, and they also presented findings about the murders of Alan Barnes, Neil Muir, Peter Stogneff, and Mark Langley. He said that the way in which these young men were picked up were through fake vehicle breakdowns, having a lure in the car, so having an attractive female in the car, and just picking up hitchhikers, inviting them into the car, and giving them drinks which were likely laced with drugs. He said, "I have in fact perused a number of statements from victims who fortunately survived the ordeal. Statements given by these people have been checked and rechecked, and there is no doubt that their account of what happened are substantially true and not fanciful." In March of 1988, the South Australian government offered a $250,000 reward for any information that could lead to the conviction of a killer of one of these 5 men, including Richard Kelvin, because they didn't believe that Von Ironum was alone. After returning no leads by September of 1989, this reward was increased to $500,000. In the years following his conviction, police said that they spoke to many more witnesses who claimed to have been with Von Ironum when he picked up and drugged young men. Despite this though, the investigation wasn't really going anywhere, so in September of 1989, they reached out to Mr. B again to see if he had any more information, and they also offered him immunity if it did turn out he was involved in any of the sexual assaults. However, this immunity didn't cover him if he was involved in any of the murders. Mr. B told police that he met up with Von Ironum the night that Alan Barnes disappeared, and that they had actually picked Alan up together. He had been hitchhiking and asked him if he could get a ride back to his home in Salisbury, and Von Ironum said no worries. He offered him a drink, and as they drove, Von Ironum told Alan of this party he could take him to with more drinks and girls. At some point, Von Ironum got out of the car to take a call, and he came back and told Mr. B that he had plans to meet up with an associate at a toilet block on the Torrens River near Jolly's boathouse. They then drove to the location, and at this point, Alan Barnes was unconscious in the back seat, and Mr. B waited inside the car while Von Ironum went and met with this associate and spoke to this associate. And when he got back to the car, he asked Mr. B if he wanted to come and perform surgery on Alan, and he told Mr. B that they were planning on assaulting and murdering Alan, and Mr. B said that he apparently said no and walked away. Mr. B also claimed that he met Von Ironum in the city a couple days later, and Von Ironum told him that Alan had died, and if he told anyone anything, that he would be implicated in the murder too. Although investigators did believe that Mr. B kind of played down his role in the whole thing to avoid implicating himself. On the 15th of September in 1989, Detective Trevor Kipling went and paid Von Ironum a visit in prison and charged him with the murder of Alan Barnes. On the 10th of November, Kipling went back to the jail and formally charged him with the murder of Mark Langley. The committal hearing began on the 5th of March in 1990, and Mr. B testified at this hearing and said that Von Ironum had mentioned that he was involved in 2 other high-profile abductions. He said he was involved in the abduction of the Beaumont children back in 1966, which was a huge case here in Australia, and I actually did a video on that case over 4 years ago now, which is crazy. So if you're interested, I'll put the link in the description for you to check out. The second abduction he said he was involved in was the disappearance of Christy Gordon and Janine Ratcliffe in 1973, but there was no evidence to support these claims. When asked if the reward money had anything to do with Mr. B testifying, he said that it did, but only because he feared for his life and would need to flee the country. He also claimed that one of the people involved in Alan Barnes' murder was sitting in the gallery story as he testified. Mr. B's sister also testified at the hearing, and she said that one time she came home and her brother told her about the fact that he had seen a murder and had seen the body been thrown off a bridge, talking about Alan Barnes' murder. In June of 1990, it was ruled that Von Ironum would stand trial for the murders of Mark Langley and Alan Barnes. However, in December of that year, the charges against him for the murder of Mark Langley were dropped, and then in February of 1991, the charges against him for the murder of Alan Barnes were dropped because the prosecution didn't believe that they could secure a conviction based on the available admissible evidence. Okay, so obviously by this point Von Ironum is in prison, and specifically he was in Yatala Labour Prison, and it came out that he actually lived a pretty privileged life in prison. In 2006, a former prison officer known as Mary said that she had a close relationship with Von Ironum over the years. She said he was polite and friendly and gentle. She would bring him home-cooked meals and would buy him art supplies when he mentioned that he wanted to do some painting. Other officers then paid Von Ironum with money and tobacco for him to then paint them greeting cards and stuff like that. Mary said that she would let Von Ironum sit in the officers' station, which contained confidential information about other prisoners, and they would just sit there and eat cake and drink coffee. Officers also allowed Von Ironum to use their phones. In 2005, a prison doctor prescribed Von Ironum with Cialis, which is used to treat erectile dysfunction, and that same year he raped and sexually assaulted another inmate so badly that he required extensive surgery to repair internal injuries. Von Ironum was charged with this rape, but in 2007 the charges were dropped as there was insufficient evidence to convict him, but following this, the drug Cialis and similar drugs were banned from prisons. In 2007, months before Von Ironum was due to be released, the legislation in South Australia changed, allowing the state government to revoke non-parole periods for dangerous criminals, and Von Ironum was classed as a dangerous criminal, and so he will never be released from prison. In 2008, the case was reopened as there was change in DNA legislation that allowed police to test DNA from potential suspects in indictable offences. By this point, they had 3 suspects who they believe aided Von Ironum, as well as 9 others associated with the crimes. The first suspect was the businessman that I spoke about earlier. He was a known associate of Von Ironum, he had visited him multiple times in prison, and he was actually also going to be indicted as a co-conspirator in the case against Von Ironum for the murders of Mark Langley and Alan Barnes before that case was dropped. The second suspect was his roommate, Stephen Woodard. He was a doctor, and he was actually later accused of several sexual assaults against young men between 1982 and 1984. Police believed that he supplied Von Ironum and the businessman with drugs and surgical expertise when needed. The third suspect was Mr. B, who was a former sex worker and was close friends with both Von Ironum and the businessman. He had testified that he was with Von Ironum when they abducted Alan Barnes, and there was also other information to indicate that he had been involved in the abduction, drugging, and sexual abuse of many young men in Adelaide. In December 2010, it was revealed that the cold case review failed to turn up any new evidence and no charges were laid. In 2014, the family of Trevor Peters, who was a gay man that was friends with Von Ironum in the 70s and 80s, was clearing out his things from his Kensington apartment a few days after he passed away. While going through his belongings, they found a diary in which he wrote about his friendship with Von Ironum and other people who ran in their circle, such as the businessman and Stephen Woodard, and they found an entry from just after Alan Barnes went missing in June of 1979. The entry spoke about how Trevor was getting his hair done at the same hairdressing salon that Von Ironum gets his hair done at, and Von Ironum walked in and he was in a really good mood and he looked at the hairdresser and they both seemed to be excited about something. I'm going to read you a little bit of the diary entry. It read, "I could hear Bevan and the hairdresser giggling and laughing, and both said, 'Ooh, how evil. Ooh, it's evil.' I found them huddled over a waist-high table directly behind the curtain of the salon. There was a group of photographs, Polaroids, laid out on the table, maybe 4, 5, or 6 of them, with Bevan holding more in his hand. They began to collect the photos quickly, but not before I saw them. The photographs were of a young, attractive, blonde-haired man lying on his side of the front seat of a car with his legs bent toward the steering wheel. I was shocked at seeing the photos, and they both hurriedly gathered them up, with Bevan putting them all into his back pocket of his trousers. When I asked who the young man was, Bevan just said, 'Oh, some hitchhiker.' And the description of the photos that he was talking about was so graphic that they were never released. Trevor wrote in his diary that he visited the hairdresser in 1990 to confront him about the photos he had seen back in 1979, and the hairdresser told him there were dozens more photos of dozens more young men that Von Ironum had shown him that more often than not had objects inserted into their anus. Trevor wrote that the hairdresser told him he didn't remember any photos being at the salon, and if you know what's good for you, you won't either. And that entry was from 4 days before he died. After reading through the diary, police believe that Trevor may have known something about the murders because he had accurately described the inner workings of von Ironum's circle back in the 70s and 80s, and it was his own diary that nobody else had ever seen, so he had no reason to lie. It was also found that Trevor actually lived next door to P&K at their house in Alberton, but by the time the diary contents were published, one of the women had already passed away. Unfortunately, still to this day, there have been no convictions in the murders of Neil Muir, Alan Barnes, Peter Stogneff, and Mark Langley. A reward of $200,000 is still on offer for any information leading to the conviction of anyone involved in the murders of Mark Langley and Neil Muir. A $1 million reward is on offer for any information leading to the conviction of anybody in the murders of Alan Barnes and Peter Stogneff. And despite von Ironum's conviction, there is still a $1 million reward for any information leading to the conviction of anyone else involved in the murder of Richard Kelvin. If you have any information at all, you are urged to call Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000 or visit their website at crimestoppers.com.au. But that is all of the information that I have on this case. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Honestly, my heart really goes out to the victims and their families. The fact that nobody has ever been convicted of these crimes is so heartbreaking. As always, I would love to discuss your thoughts in the comments down below. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully I will see you in my next video. Bye guys!